Welcome to Lesson 2, Costs of Purchasing a Cooperative or Condominium. This goes along with our objectives. Our first objective is to understand the alternatives to renting an apartment. And two of those alternatives are to purchase a cooperative or a condominium. We're also going to be looking at fees and how to calculate ownership percentages associated with these types of ownership. Below here is a picture of the United States, and it shows you the percent of renters and the percent of owners on the West Coast as compared to New York City. And if you'll notice, what's interesting is there's a lot more renters in New York City than there are on the USA. It's almost flipped. 69% of people in New York City rent versus 67% of people who own on the West Coast. And you can see that it's the same thing, 33% actually rent on the West Coast versus only 31% own on the East Coast, or specifically New York City. So it's just something interesting to reflect on why that is. Perhaps the cost of renting in New York is quite a bit cheaper than is the cost of purchasing and owning a property. And if you think about perhaps why, there's not as much open space. It's Manhattan. It's almost like an island in and of itself. You can't grow land, so it's very expensive to purchase any kind of property in New York City. All right, let's look here at condominiums. So a condominium is a form of home ownership. So you're actually purchasing something, but they kind of look like this. They almost look like townhomes or apartments in a way, where each unit though is individually owned, and this is very common. What ends up happening is that you're assessed a fee, usually every month or every year, for common parts of the property, like driveways or the gardens or the grounds, common areas, anything that's jointly owned. Typically, the condominium owners, though, are responsible for the maintenance of the inside of their own unit. So you can't call someone if your heater breaks to come and fix it or change a light bulb. That's your responsibility because you own the inside of your condo. And like we just said, condo owners are charged a maintenance fee usually to hire people to maintain those common areas. So that's a fee associated with a condominium. But typically people like to purchase a condominium because they don't want to take on all the work that's involved in having a home, like shoveling snow or cutting your lawn or maintaining an outside area. All right, let's look at some cooperatives. So a cooperative is a corporation, actually, that owns a group of apartments, and the corporation is the one that takes out the mortgage to buy the whole complex. And then what you do is you purchase shares in the co-op, kind of like purchasing shares in a stock like Disney or Kellogg's. And these shares will then allow you to occupy and live in those apartments. So in this case, you do not own your individual apartment. What you own is a portion of the entire corporation, the entire cooperative development. You can sell your shares of ownership and you may have a profit or you may have a loss, just like when you sell a regular share of stock. So that's kind of an advantage of that, is that there's not a lot of baggage. It's just treated as a share in a corporation. And typically co-op owners also pay a monthly fee. Here's a graph of the growth of senior cooperative housing in the United States. Notice back here in maybe 1977, it was pretty low, and then it's just really grown almost at an exponential rate, right? Not linear because it's not a straight line, but almost exponential. It's growing super fast until here it kind of tapers off a little bit, but still quite a few cooperative housing units that have been purchased by seniors. And this actually takes you to about 2011. And you wonder why that is, and part of the reason might be that there's a lot more cooperative housing units that have been built that seniors move into. Some of those units can be nursing type homes, and it's just much easier for elderly to live in that situation. Also, when they die, they don't have something that has to be bought and sold as complicated as an actual house or a condominium. They just have some shares that can be inherited or can be sold. All right, let's look at some fees. So here's our first scenario. Here's with a condominium. And as we said before, when you own a condominium, oftentimes you have to pay maintenance fees for those common areas that everybody shares. One of the positives about ownership of any kind is, well, with the exception of co-ops, because you actually just own shares, but with a home, with a condominium, with a townhome, you are entitled to deduct property, or sometimes called real estate taxes, as well as mortgage interest on your loan. So if you take out a loan, you can deduct the mortgage interest, and then the property taxes that you're going to pay, those are also deductible. So that helps you tax-wise. So here's our situation. You own your own condominium and you pay a monthly condominium maintenance fee of $912 every month. And that is made up of a variety of things, but you are told that 15% of this fee pays your monthly property taxes. And because you can deduct those on your taxes, you need to know how much those are come April 15th so you can properly file your tax return. So how do you figure this out? All right, let's look. So first, we need to find 15% of our monthly maintenance fee, and we do that by multiplying. Right? It says that 15% is our property tax, so we need to multiply. So we get 0.15, and again, remember to always change the percent to a decimal, times 912, and that gives you your monthly property tax of $136.80. So that's just monthly, but we need to find how much we paid in an entire year. So we just multiply that by 12 and we get our annual property tax. And that comes to $1,641.60. So that is what we get to deduct on our tax return in April. So very important information to know. For our next scenario, let's go ahead and look at cooperatives. So in this scenario, you are a co-op owner. So if you think about a co-op, it's similar to owning shares of stock like we talked about earlier, but it's important to know what percent you own of the total co-op so that you can determine how to allocate fees that you have to pay, as well as determine maybe your gain or loss if you sell your shares. So the Mile High Housing Association was a co-op here in Denver, and in this scenario, we're going to assume they have a total of 50,000 shares, and that Janet has a home at the Mile High Housing and owns 550 shares of the cooperative. Our questions are, what percentage does Janet own? And also, we want to know how much of the annual assessment she will have to pay. So you are paying the assessment based on your ownership percentage, and this year's annual assessment comes to $12,500. So let's go ahead and look at our solution here. So first we need to figure out what percent she owns, and we know that she owns 550 out of 50,000 shares. So we want to express that as a fraction. So we would write 550 over 50,000. And then to find our percent, we just divide those. So when we divide those, we get 0.011, which if we move the decimal back 2 places, multiply by 100, we find out that Janet owns 1.1% of the co-op. In order to determine assessments, we just take her percentage, but as a decimal, 0.011, and multiply it by the annual assessment, and we find out that she has to pay $137.50. And those annual assessments, remember, are things that have to do with common areas, and maybe the sidewalk needed to be repaired, or the driveway needed to be redone, or something like that. So typically those are what the annual assessments might be. Okay, so for today's lesson, we have talked about co-ops, and we've talked about condominiums, some of the fees that are associated with those, as well as how to determine your ownership percentage and the importance of knowing what your ownership percentage is as far as fees and taxes and gains and losses. And that concludes our lesson for today.